Okay, this video is really a continuation of the previous video in many respects, although it will introduce another data cleaning tool, specifically the merge command. What the merge command enables you to do is take data sets that are otherwise identical but have different variables and combine those variables into a single data set. In the previous video, you saw me take CO2 emissions data from the World Bank Open Data website, do some cleaning up, perform a reshape command, taking that wide data and turning it into long data. And that way I can actually use that data to run regressions and to do all of that fun stuff inside of Stata. Well, I went ahead and I downloaded the GDP data also from the World Bank Open Data website. And then I did everything exactly the same as I did the CO2 data. So if you haven't seen that video, go back and watch that video first. That will explain how I got the data to the form that you see it here, albeit with the CO2 data. So anyway, so I took the GDP data, I did exactly the same thing. And so as you'll remember from the previous video, the CO2 data looks identical to this. We have a column with country, a column with a country code, a column with the year, and then the column with the actual variable. In that case, CO2, and in this case, gross domestic product, GDP. So what we want to do is we want to take the CO2 data and the GDP data, and we want them to be into the same data set. We have to do a couple things first, though, before we attempt to merge the data. The one thing that's important is that beyond the two data sets being largely identical, except for those variables we're looking to merge, we also have to make sure that both data sets are sorted the same way. And so the way that we make sure this occurs is we run a sort command. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort it first by country, then by year. Again, I don't have to put code in there. I just do it because it makes a little bit more sense to me to put it in there. And so I'm going to sort by country, code, and year. I'm going to hit enter there, and then I'm going to save the GDP data set. The GDP data set's already saved in my working directory, so to save this new version of it, I simply put comma and replace. And the only thing that I've done to the data set is I've sorted the data in this specific manner. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call up the CO2 data that I also saved to the working directory. It's really important that, not important, it's crucial that the data sets you're using to merge are in the same working directory. For me, I've just made, just for the simplicity of this particular example, I've made the desktop here the working directory, and you can see that I have the two data sets, the GDP data and the CO2 data. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call up the CO2 data, and I'm going to sort it the way that we sorted the GDP data. So use CO2 and then clear. If I just use CO2, it'll give me this. Well, actually, it didn't. Normally, if I just try to open up the CO2 data, it will tell me, hey, you're going to lose the GDP data that you were working with. And honestly, that's usually what it does. As we can see here, it didn't tell me that, so no worries. If you do, when you're using Stata, if you do try to use the use data set command and it does tell you, no, you would lose your work, that's usually the message that it sends you. All you have to do is put clear on the end of that, and that would take care of that. But for this, for whatever reason, it didn't ask me that. It didn't ask me to do that. So again, so now I have the CO2 data. Just to kind of give you a visual here, you can see that the data is exactly identical, and that this is CO2 data. The other, of course, was GDP data. So we're going to sort country, code, year. Again, the exact same sorting strategy that we use for the GDP data set. We're going to replicate that here with the CO2 data set. We're going to save the CO2 data set. It's really important that you save it here. It becomes problematic if you do not. So again, because there's already a CO2 data set and all I've done is sort them, I'm going to say save CO2 and replace. All right, so now we're actually ready to perform our merge. And the merge command is pretty straightforward. So we start by saying merge. Now, real quick, you want to make sure that you have one of the data sets open and loaded in order to perform the merge, because you're going to call up the other data set within the command itself. So here we have the CO2 data set open. This means we're going to merge with the GDP data set. So or I could have the GDP data set open and I could merge the CO2 data set with it. So merge, and then what I put next is the specific variables, which are the unique identifiers in the previous data set. Again, just for completeness, I'm going to use country, code, year. Again, code here is probably a little redundant. I probably don't have to use it, but I just like to use it because it keeps everything nice and straightforward, and because this is the way that we sorted the data. And again, it just makes, I think, the code look a little bit, so say consistent, I think is a good word, if I can remember words, because words are hard sometimes. So, okay, merge country code year. This tells Stata what it's going to use for the merge. And so in other words, what it's going to do is that Stata is going to, basically ask itself, where am I going to stick this GDP data relative to the data set that we're currently in? And what I'm telling it by using this for the merge command is I want you to make sure that you're putting the same country, the code, and the year, that observation. So the Afghanistan in year 1960 CO2 is going to be right beside the Afghanistan in 1960 GDP, which is of course exactly the way I want it. So merge country code year, and then we're going to do using. And so this is where I actually tell Stata what the other data set is that I want to merge. And so using GDP. And so that GDP is the data set. So I'm telling Stata, I want to merge the CO2 data. I want to merge using country code and year. And I want to use the GDP data set as the merge. So I hit enter, and I go to the data editor. And now I see there's two new columns. There's the GDP column, which is exactly the way I want it. And then there's this merge column. This merge column is, again, something that Stata uses to help it along the way in terms of how to merge. If you go back out, there's a potential that some data didn't merge. And so what you do is you say drop if merge does not equal 3. Because this is the way Stata codes if the merge was successful, is it puts a 3 there. So you see all of these are 3 because it found matches. If it doesn't find a match, it doesn't put a 3 for merge. And so what I'm essentially doing here is I'm dropping all of my unmatched merges. So anything that doesn't match is going to get dropped. This could be problematic, so you want to make sure that, if you do this and it drops a lot, you may want to go back and make sure that you did your merge correctly. But usually this is not going to have much of an effect, assuming that the two data sets that you merge together are nearly identical. And of course, we know that because both of these data sets rely upon the World Bank Open data. They're otherwise identical except for the actual substance of the data themselves. All right, so drop if merge doesn't equal 3. Okay, you'll see that I did lose some observations. This just means that there was some mismatch in terms of the countries, but 792 observations dropped from a data set as large as this one is not a problem. Now, you may want to go back in and you may want to see what was dropped, but for the most part, this is not an issue at all. And so what we can then do is then just drop the merge variable to get rid of it. And so we go back to the data editor, and now we can see we have a nice data set, a nice panel data set, countries, the year, and then the observations of variables in those years. And I always like to just make sure that everything's nice and lined up. So we just go down to the very bottom, and we can see that everything matches up nicely. One thing that you always want to pay attention to as you're cleaning data is scroll down and make sure that you don't have any mismatches here. Like, make sure that you don't have one column which is longer than another column in ways that you don't think it should be. So always make sure you're kind of venturing down, checking on your data to make sure if you've done any manipulation to it, like a merge, make sure that this part, looks consistent. But then everything looks good here. And there you go. That's how you merge two data sets into one. The key here is to keep in mind that when you merge data sets, they need to be largely identical except for the data that you're merging. So I took the CO2, which was the what we call the master data set, and then I merged it with the GDP data set, which is the using data set in the particular example that we just looked at. Those data sets were identical, except of course for that they had two different sets of observations, one for CO2 and one for GDP. Sometimes students will try to merge data sets that are not as consistent as this, and that will cause problems. So make sure that you try to make your data sets as identical as possible before you merge them.